By former Deputy White House Chief of Staff Harold Ickes. He spoke this week at the City Club of Chicago.
Thank you. Jay, thank you for that extraordinarily generous introduction. I adopt all of the facts you recited and will redo my resume. Now, you were right on target, and I greatly appreciate it. I also want to express my appreciation to your chairman, Tom Roser, and to Jay for inviting me to speak today and for giving me the opportunity to again visit this extraordinary city, which in so many ways personifies that which is unique to America. My thanks also to your executive director, James Licklider, for his help in getting today organized, at least for us. My partner, Janice Enright, who's already been introduced, and I are really very, very delighted to be here. I want to acknowledge four individuals before going on to my remarks. First, although he's not here, Mayor Daley. As I learned firsthand during the 1996 Democratic Convention, which I oversaw from the White House, he is a no-nonsense, hands-on administrator of the first order. His agenda, the city of Chicago, and he is to be applauded. Second, I can't speak with the eloquence of the person who did refer to the chairman, but let me say a few words about him, if I may. Chairman Dan Rostenkowski. I salute him for his leadership and outstanding service to this city and to the nation. One of my lasting memories of when I first went to Washington, D.C., I had never met the legend, and I went up to the Hill in 1994 when we were managing the health care initiative, and it was a lasting memory to meet the chairman in his own precinct on Capitol Hill. It was a big precinct. He also provides an extraordinary example, in my view, of persevering with grace and style in the face of profound adversity. Chairman Rostenkowski. I want to pay tribute to another son of Chicago, Secretary of Commerce Bill Daley, for his outstanding leadership in Washington. And finally, to one of your own, Hillary Rodham Clinton, my friend of many years. She's been my friend for many years, and she's a person for whom my respect and admiration and fondness grow more each year. Although the focus has undoubtedly shifted and certainly expanded since it was first organized in 1903, the work of the City Club remains as important and as relevant as today as it did in those days of taking on the gray wolves. Your work has contributed greatly to the betterment of the people of Chicago and Illinois. You set a high standard. And although this is my first time here, I feel quite at home. According to the history books, my father, Harold L. Ickes, Claire Ickes, as he was called in those days, was one of the very early behind-the-scenes organizers of the City Club. Indeed, this beautifully restored room is one in which my father attended many of the club's meetings. According to the bulletins of the City Club of Chicago, my father made a luncheon presentation to the club on June 27, 1907, over 90 years before his son would have the honor of addressing you. The topic: proposed changes to the city charter of Chicago by the Illinois State Legislature. Quite a contrast to many of today's topics. Concerned about the influence and power of the gray wolves, my father argued in favor of having 2 aldermen for each of 23 wards, rather than 1 alderman for each of Chicago's proposed 50 wards. In 1921, as some of you know, The number of wards were increased from 35 to the current 50. So much for my father's advice. Although born in Altoona, Pennsylvania, my father considered Chicago his home and his political base. He was 16 years old when he moved here in 1890, after the death of his mother. During his high school years, he lived with his aunt and uncle in Englewood, working for room and board in his uncle's drugstore. In 1893, he entered the then new University of Chicago at Hyde Park, headed by William Rainey Harper, from where he subsequently graduated. During the latter part of the 1890s, he worked as a reporter for several of Chicago's newspapers, including McCormick's Chicago Trib, earning as much as $35 a week as a space writer. It was not until 1903 that he entered the University of Chicago Law School. As an attorney, his biographer, T.H. Watkins, had this to say of my father, and I quote, "Harold Leclerc Ickes, attorney at law, did not bring to his new profession a consummate love of the law as an institution. No one then or now would confuse him with that other Chicago attorney, Clarence Darrow. He cast his first presidential vote in 1896 for Republican McKinley. But, Mr. Chairman, that same year, he cast his first gubernatorial vote for Democratic candidate John Atgill. So he's somewhat redeemed, hopefully, in your eyes. As a member of the, as has been mentioned before, as a member of the progressive wing of the Republican Party, he worked with reformers of the day, including Jane Addams of Hull House fame. Those of you who are Irish in this room, take no offense at the next paragraph. I'm Irish also. But he was also acquainted with the likes of Bathhouse John Coghlan, the keeper of the Silver Dollar Saloon, and Michael Hinky Dink Kenna, described as the dapper genius of street-level organization. Bosses of the then First Ward, which included the bordellos and gambling houses of the Levee, Bathhouse John and Hinky Dink, were two of the most powerful in the city. Although my father worked with Chicago's self-styled reformers during the 43 years that he lived here, he was intrigued with the political bosses. Of them, no insult meant, he had this to say, and I quote, "I confess that I liked and enjoyed the company of the crooks. They had real human qualities, most of them. No one should take this personally either, but he found the reformers, and I quote, aloof and austere. They had a veneer that was like the polish on a slab of granite and contrasted unfavorably with the warm joviality of the Irish political chieftains. Social and political reformer, newspaperman, politician, political operative, lawyer. My father was deeply involved in the fabric of this great city, and because of him, I feel connected in a very real way to Chicago. But enough of the past. I was asked to talk today about some of my memorable impressions, I underline the word impressions, of serving as assistant to the President and Deputy Chief of Staff in the Clinton White House, a position that I held for 3 years during the President's first term. I was asked to hold my remarks to about 30 minutes. For those of you who have followed the Clinton administration, you know what an impossible task that is. But here goes. I understand that the City Club is nonpartisan. I confess proudly to having been a lifelong Democrat. So if I wander a tad from the nonpartisan nature of this club in this room, please forgive me. Public service is a great privilege. To participate, as many of you have in this room, in the shaping of public policy and events is a high calling. But public service too often exacts an extraordinarily high price, financial and psychological and it is often exhausting. Since I resigned from the White House, people often ask how I'm doing. My response: not nearly as well as my lawyers. One of whom will be here next week. Only one of whom. With considerable dismay, but complete frankness, based on my experience in Washington, my first words of advice to anyone considering public service at a relatively high level in Washington are: get a damn good lawyer and a competent accountant, and negotiate the fees up front. With increasing frequency, outstanding and dedicated public servants, like our former Secretary of Department of Housing and Urban Development, Henry Cisneros, are forced to leave public service to earn enough to pay for legal fees resulting from investigations by independent counsels, accountable, it seems, to no one, and funded by unlimited public monies. Enacted in 1978, following the Watergate scandal, the independent counsel statute has quite literally become a full employment program for much of the Washington, D.C. bar, including its bankruptcy section. In fact, it appears that there's now a shortage of attorneys in Washington, something I thought I would never see. And they are now reaching as far away as Chicago to find legal talent. According to the recent report of the Federal General Accounting Office, to date, independent counsel Barrett has spent $7.8 million in connection with allegations that Henry Cisneros may have made false statements to the FBI about $250,000 in payments he made to his former mistress long before he entered government. This, however, pales in comparison to the over $17 million spent to date by independent counsel Donald Schmaltz in his investigation of former Secretary of Agriculture Mike Espy regarding allegations that he accepted $35,000 in illegal gratuities, such as tickets to sporting events. Then there's Ken Starr. After 4 years, assisted by a staff of hundreds of law enforcement personnel, employing 3 grand juries in Arkansas, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., and spending over $40 million, he has not reported any alleged illegality by President Clinton or Mrs. Clinton in connection with the Whitewater real estate transaction, the White House travel office, or the FBI file situation. Apparently, desperate to justify his tenure as independent counsel and to try to achieve what, in my view, is his ultimate political goal of driving the president from office, Mr. Starr, using evidence of questionable validity, may well have blindsided Attorney General Reno into authorizing jurisdiction over the Monica Lewinsky situation. And now, the Republicans in Congress are hell-bent on what appears to be a highly partisan impeachment inquiry, the primary purpose of which is to increase their majorities in the Senate and the House this November. I ask, how has the public interest been advanced? Is the nation better off than it would have been without Mr. Starr's inquiry? What has been accomplished? And at what cost, political and otherwise? From my very personal point of view, I can tally some of the costs of serving in government, not all financial. Since joining the White House staff in early January 1994, I've given sworn testimony some 25 different times, including to 4 federal grand juries, to Senate and House investigation committees, in public hearings, in numerous depositions to congressional staff, to inspectors general, and to a large variety of assistant United States attorneys and FBI agents. I have been deposed in a civil action against the federal government in connection with the FBI file matter. And nearly 2 years since leaving government service, there is yet no end in sight. In all of these proceedings, I have been only a third-party witness. Fortunately, I have never yet, and hope not to be, been named either a target or a subject. I have incurred hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal fees, all of which are my own personal responsibility. I've watched my 12-year-old daughter, Charlotte Jane, become all too familiar with subjects such as subpoenas, depositions, allegations of obstruction of justice, alleged perjury, oral sex, and Larry Klayman of Judicial Watch demanding to know the name of her 2 pussycats during his recent deposition of me. All too frequently she asks, "Are you going to jail, Daddy?" Fortunately, however, these impressions are not the only aspect of public service. We'll get to the later part. An important one, but thankfully not the only one. Yes, the price exacted by public service is too often very high, and unfortunately for some, simply unsustainable. But in most cases, as was in my case, the benefits of public service greatly exceed the costs. I recall with the exhilaration, hope, and promise of primary night in New York in 1992, when his nomination finally seemed assured, and of election that November, election night in Little Rock, as the results confirmed President Clinton's victory. In no small measure, his victory represented the deep concern of many Americans about the drift of the nation and whether we were adequately prepared to lead effectively in a rapidly changing economy and society. That exhilaration was immediately followed by the reality of having to select and put in place a new government during the mere 10 weeks between the general election and the inauguration. Unlike a parliamentary system, where the winning party quite literally has a government in waiting, under our constitutional system, a new president-elect and his key advisors, especially in a very close election, as 1992 was, did not begin to focus on selecting the members of the incoming cabinet, to staffing the top echelons of the federal government, or to organizing and staffing the White House until after the election. Few of us working on this 10-week transition had actually served in the federal government, and most of those who had served had last done so in the 1970s. President-elect Clinton focused almost exclusively on selecting his cabinet and dealing with the key economic and other policy issues. Staffing the White House, some of you may be dismayed to know, was left to me and others. Virtually none of us with any prior operational White House experience, so we went in sort of with an open mind. In retrospect, some of the situations were almost comical. For example, was the mess a messy office, or was it a place to eat? Where was it located? Who could use it? Or, as another example, what were the qualifications of the staff secretary? Did he or she need to be a highly competent stenographer, or adept at cataloging documents, or, as it turned out, a highly organized person who could deal with a broad range of substantive issues on a daily basis and with the judgment to decide what should be forwarded to the president and what needed additional work and should not be sent to him at that time. Even those of you in this room and others who are steeped in the management of large organizations undoubtedly would shudder at the proposition of recruiting and organizing the top level of an institution as large and as complex as the federal government in 10 weeks. Then there was my first year as Deputy Chief of Staff. I quickly learned the powers of the presidency and the very central and critical role that the modern White House plays in running the federal government and in developing policy. More importantly, and even more quickly, I came to understand the limits of presidential power and influence. Having been asked by the President during December 1993 to come to Washington to help manage his health care initiative, it was only within several days of joining the White House staff during the first week of January of 1994 that I was charged with the responsibility of dealing with Whitewater and other so-called scandals. At that time, I didn't even know Whitewater dealt with real estate. By the time Harry and Louise finished, the President's health care initiative didn't even make it out of any of the 5 or so congressional committees that considered it. And then there was the 1994 midterm election. Before those elections, George Mitchell presided over the Senate, and it was Speaker Gebhardt. After the election, it was Majority Leader Dole, and Newt Gingrich took up the Speaker's gavel. Despite the short distance from my office to the West Wing, to the President's office in the residence, one of the longest walks of my political career was on election night of 1994 to inform him of the election results. For some odd reason, he was not moved by my argument that we might well be better off with the radical Republicans in charge of the House compared to only having a very slim Democratic majority. In short, given Whitewater, health care, and the midterm elections, it is an understatement to say that 1994 was hardly an auspicious year. I did, however, learn much about limits. As it turned out, Newt Gingrich and his merry band of radicals in the House, fortunately, did not hide their light under a bushel. They proudly tacked their contract for America on the front door of the Congress and then proceeded actually to try to implement it. Their goal, to dismember as much of the federal government and most of its programs as quickly as possible. The American people, sensible and practical as they are, quickly came to understand that unacceptable revolution was in the offing if Newt and his gang had their unfettered way. There's certainly no doubt a vast majority of Americans, quite rightly, had come to view government as all too often unresponsive and ineffective, too often more of a hindrance than a help. At the same time, however, they understood the roles that government could and should play in an ever-increasingly complex and interrelated nation and world, and they did not want it eliminated. The fight of 1995 and 1996 over the budget, which resulted in 2 shutdowns of the federal government, was, in effect, a great debate about priorities, and the role, size, and function of government, especially at the federal level. Not since the 1930s has the nation engaged in such a vigorous and important debate, and that debate continues as it should. Although the Republicans are now trying to take credit for the first federal budget surplus in 30 years, let us not forget the facts. Under Presidents Reagan and Bush, those apostles of small government, lower taxes, reduce spending, etc., the federal government had expanded, not contracted. The overall federal budget had increased. The economy had been run into a ditch. And for the first time in its history, the Republic had a structural deficit of several hundreds of billions of dollars annually with no end in sight. Those are the facts. People had lost confidence that our leaders had the foggiest idea of how to begin to prepare us to meet the challenges of a radically changed economy and increasing global competition to move into the 21st century. Think back to the great debate of 1993 about what priority should be given to dealing in a real way with the structural deficit that was quite literally choking the nation's economy. President Clinton made a most difficult political decision then to defer one of his key 1992 campaign promises of a middle-class tax cut. Rather than continuing the Washington tradition of talking it to death, he decided to take on the task, unpopular with many members of his own party at the time, of really getting control of the annual deficit. Without one single Republican vote, the Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate adopted legislation to deal with that economic situation. That, ladies and gentlemen, is public service writ large. By contrast, much like Chicken Little, Newt Gingrich, Dick Armey, and many of their colleagues proclaimed the sky would fall. Interest rates would rise to unacceptable levels. Unemployment would increase. The economy would slide into recession. Need I say more? Then there is the press. What can I say about the press? Having been involved in New York politics for so many years and in a score of presidential campaigns before coming to the White House, I had some appreciation of intense press coverage. The coverage of the White House is, however, of a completely different order of magnitude. Every word from the top echelons of the White House staff is scrutinized for nuance of meaning. Every possible interpretation, some reasonable, many completely off the wall, are often given equal billing. The discrete number of daily news cycles of a decade ago are no longer. They have been replaced by one cycle, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is not unusual for top staff in the White House to first learn of events initiated by the White House by tuning in to CNN's redoubtable Wolf Blitzer, planted on the White House lawn. The intensity of a 24-hour day coverage, the increasing blurring of distinctions between facts and opinion, news as entertainment, with no less than 3 virtually all-time Monica channels today in Washington. The increasing influence of television news, which all too often sacrifices reflection for the soundbite. The instantaneous movement of news by the internet. The fracturing of news, by which I mean the lack of coherency, perspective, and context of too much of reported news. And the intense competition among an increasing number of organizations and news providers, some of which are less than reliable. All of these factors, in my view, have very much affected the decision-making process of government at both the national, state, and local level. Let me give you an example. A government official does not have an instantaneous response for a breaking issue. He or she runs the very serious risk of being accused of either stonewalling or not having a policy. Yet the issue under discussion may be highly complex, as many are, and nuanced, and therefore not subject to a soundbite answer, or it may still be in the development stage. The detrimental implications of this are all too obvious. Another memorable impression of my years at the White House and following is the cast of fantastic characters that have paraded across the stage of the theater of the absurd that is so much a part of Washington. Headliners, and you can add your own, but my headliners would include Paula Jones, Jim and Susan McDougal, the trio of Hong, Chung, and Tree. Roger, I would have paid $300,000, Tamaraz. Monica Lewinsky, Gil Ginsburg, Linda Tripp, Lucy Ann Goldberg, Richard Mellon Scaife, the Federalist Society, Warren Medoff, Kathleen Willey, Ken Starr, and his horde of sleuths and prosecutors. You can add your own, a virtual commedia dell'arte. On a more serious note, I often think of the opportunity that I was given to participate in the decision-making process at the White House, knowing that those decisions would in many cases affect all of our people, indeed people around the world. To actually make a real difference in the lives of a large number of Americans, by putting the economy back on track, by standing up to tobacco's calculated seduction of our kids, by making it harder for people to get guns, by making it easier for people to spend time with their new babies or sick parents, by reforming how government is organized and works, by initiating reform in our healthcare system, by talking honestly to the country about the need to break down trade barriers around the world, to mention only a few. I think of observing firsthand the isolation of the White House, coming to understand in a very real way the difficulty of the issues that cannot be resolved at a level below the president. That for those issues which only he can resolve, there are no easy or pat answers, only various shades of gray. Observing the loneliness of the Oval Office, how many times have I participated in vigorous, highly charged debate with the president and other advisors? Typically, he knew more about the subtleties of the issue than even the most knowledgeable of advisors. After the discussion closed and we filed out, I would look back at him, sitting alone with the burden of making the decision. Although I've been involved in various aspects of politics beginning in 1964, when I helped Fannie Lou Hamer and others to organize an integrated delegation from Mississippi to the Democratic National Convention, it was not until I served in the White House that I came to a fuller and more complete understanding about the intersection of policy and politics, especially in a nation, and the role of the political leader, especially in a nation as diverse and as complex as ours, with so many competing, often seemingly irreconcilable interests. I think of the moments of history I've witnessed. When I told the president that Prime Minister Rabin had died, and watching the tears stream down his face as he sat in utter silence that autumn Saturday. When I stood in the square in Belfast, listening to the president as waves of hope and relief washed over decades of sadness and fear. And when I mourned in Oklahoma City for the victims of the bombing, when Clinton, part preacher, part president, led the nation in sorrow and horror. That bombing broke the fever of anti-government hate, and the president came into his own as a national leader. I think also of the sense and continuity of my own personal history. When I would sit in my West Wing office at the desk my father used when he served as Secretary of the Interior under FDR. When I accompanied the president for the 50th anniversary of President Roosevelt's death to Warm Springs, a place of such intimate and modest scale that it speaks volumes of the man who sought comfort there. When I looked over the beauty of Hyde Park, of the Hudson River at Hyde Park, with President Clinton and President Yeltsin. When I witnessed the creation of the Grand Escalante Wilderness Monument in Utah, that breathtaking place that my father had worked to put under national protection, and which will now survive for generation after generation. I remember the great successes that were the 1992 Democratic National Convention in New York and the 1996 Democratic National Convention here in Chicago. And I count myself fortunate because of the many, many people that I've worked with and come to admire from politics and my days in public service. I think also of the sense of personal accomplishment in my small role in helping elect the first Democratic president in 50 years. Other than for my earlier comments about Mr. Starr, I have not touched on the president's current problems. I will say only this. Assuming, only for the sake of argument, that the president lied before a federal criminal grand jury about an extramarital relationship, it does not warrant impeachment or resignation. The president's actions were completely unacceptable. The simple fact is, the president of the United States is a role model for the nation. What he did cannot be condoned. His actions in this regard have tarnished his presidency. More unfortunately, they have tarnished the institution of the presidency. But history has proven that institution to be extraordinarily durable. It will regain its luster. It always has. And the president has apologized to the American people and to his family and has asked for forgiveness. Courtesy of Ken Starr and the Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee, the irrelevant, as well as the relevant facts about the current situation are known. The critical issue facing the nation, the Congress, and most particularly the House Judiciary Committee, is whether, under these facts, the Congress should invoke the most awesome power it has under the Constitution to remove a sitting president, to overturn the judgment of the people. Despite the apparent efforts by Chairman Hyde to have the committee conduct itself in a bipartisan manner, so far the House Republicans appear to be using this situation for the sole, narrow, partisan purpose of increasing their majorities in the Senate and the House. By doing so, they will ill serve the nation. In closing, I want to emphasize that, for me at least, my experience in Washington have underscored that public service is a high calling. Yes, it can result in great financial sacrifice. Yes, it can cause great disappointment. Yes, it sometimes breaks the heart and even the spirit. Yet, on balance, the rewards are extraordinary. To serve the public trust is a great honor. To become involved in the shaping of public policy, whether by way of working to elect a public official, or drafting and enacting legislation, or working in an agency to implement policies or legislative mandates, or serving a public official in order to make him or her more effective. Despite our many frustrations and deep disappointments, I know of no one who has served in this administration who has not been proud and honored to do so. So let me conclude by applauding all of you in this room and your predecessors who have worked hard to make the City Club the effective force it continues to be. You are the epitome of public service. Thank you very much.
Now comes time for questions, and as we said, we're going to honor the members of the City Club and people who are guests, and I would ask you to rise. James Licklider, our Executive Director, has a microphone, and when he comes to you, arise and give your name and then ask the question to Mr. Ickes. I have the first one. Mr. Ickes, the concept of the independent prosecutor started with your Democratic colleagues in 1978. It was signed by President Carter, then reaffirmed and signed over, I must say, some Republican opposition, signed by President Clinton. Are you prepared to say that it was one of the very few Democratic mistakes you're willing to acknowledge?
Well, we have made a couple of mistakes, Mr. Chairman. We might be able to recite a couple of mistakes, but very few indeed. I think the independent counsel statute has been thrown very, very gravely into question, and it will be coming up for debate, I think, this coming year. I think Ken Starr has done as much to undermine the confidence of people in that statute and the processes that it provides for as than any of his predecessors. There may well be situations in which you need an independent counsel, but I dare say, as you look back over the history of the 20 independent counsels, I can't think of one instance in which the career people at the Justice Department could not have made the judgments that were ultimately made by the independent counsels more expeditiously, less expensively, and certainly with less trauma to the political psyche. We have become so that we want to due process ourselves to death. Everything is a conflict of interest now. If you happen to know somebody on the outside who you talk to on the sidewalk and you're working in government and they're subject to a consideration of a federal agency, there's conflict of interest. There has to be a balance. But I think the singular point to make is, are we prepared to trust the career officials in the Justice Department? This is not all laid at the top of the Attorney General. There's a vast group of career people who are loyal to the government, who are loyal to the Republic, who don't necessarily owe their allegiance, although they may vote Democratic or Republican. They don't owe their allegiance to the President of the United States other than to do their duty to uphold the law. I have confidence in those people, and I have seen nothing in the last 20 councils that would warrant the reenactment of the independent counsel statute.
Okay, questions? Does the chair see hands for questions? I'm sure there are. Yes, sir. Your name, please.
Hugh Schwartzberg. Can we reasonably expect that someone who is a target of one of the independent counsels will raise the question of the constitutionality of a figure independent of the president who is not ratified by 2/3 of the Senate?
Would you do that question again? I apologize.
Mr. Ickes, would you move over here?
Judicial authority for the fact that a figure independent of the president and placed in an executive position must be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, or is otherwise himself in an unconstitutional posture. Can we reasonably expect that someone who is threatened by an independent prosecutor in the future will raise that question directly?
I don't know. It seems to me a legitimate issue, but I don't know.
Questions? Yes, sir. Your name, please.
Hal Weinstein. Assuming that the Congress and the White House will at some point arrive at an agreement regarding the Monica Lewinsky business, the question then remains of whether Ken Starr and the appeals court he is responsible to will be willing to participate in such an agreement, or by what means can they be brought into the agreement. I see a very great difficulty. Do you see a great difficulty in accomplishing such an agreement?
Well, although I'm a lawyer by license, I don't pretend to be a constitutional expert by any manner of means. It seems to me it is a very serious question you raise, and how the independent counsel is neither fish nor fowl. It's partly legislative, it's partly executive, it's partly judicial. I mean, it is something that our form of government, literally, when you start to parse it out and analyze it very carefully, as some people have done, it is a very, very strange creature indeed in the context of our constitutional form of government, a foundation of which is obviously the separation of powers. presumably, if the Congress were to reach an agreement and were to enact that agreement by way of legislation, that presumably would bind the independent counsel unless the three-judge court struck it down, at which point it would be appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. I think, however, that if Mr. Starr were to refuse to accede to an agreement struck with the Congress, it would be, it's almost unthinkable.
Ms. Kurth?
I'd be interested to hear your opinion of the solution proposed over the weekend by President Gerald Ford.
Well, I think, look, I don't want to stand here speaking for the White House or the President, and I'm certainly not. And however this washes out through the process, it'll wash out. But I think what struck me about former President Ford's article was how tempered in tone it was. And it struck me that, and he himself conceded, that he's now in his 80s and his partisan view of life may have lessened. But the fact is that even back then, and he explained his pardoning of Nixon, who some of us disagreed with at the time, but I think that as you look back on the history of it, and as you think about the rationale for the pardon, which was really to lance the boil and let the country get on with the process of governing, that was his reason, and it was a damn good reason. And I think that what he did effectively say in that article, knowing what the facts as he understood them at least, impeachment, resignation was not warranted. There should be some form of censure, however defined, and he urged that the Congress get on with that and try to come up with a bipartisan proposal that would be acceptable within the halls of Congress and acceptable to the White House. I think he made considerable sense. The thrust of it was, this is not worth what has occurred, and what's alleged is not worth overturning the will of the people, not worth an impeachment process that is going to rip at the very fabric of this country. And I think that was his fundamental point.
Mr. Burke?
Bridges, do you think that the Republican savaging of Clinton is in any respect a political vengeance for Democratic savaging of Richard Nixon? And what do you think, if you think affirmatively on either of those points, that we are in a predictive state of what will happen to the next Republican president of the United States, regardless of what grounds may be unearthed?
Good question. I hope, from a very partisan point of view, I hope that doesn't come around in the near term. But in all seriousness, it's a very good question. I'm not going to stand here and talk for what's on the minds of Republicans who are savaging the president. It's a much longer discussion. My short thumbnail of it is that I think that the Republicans felt early on in the Clinton administration that they were not going to be able to beat him on the issues, and that the only way they could take him down was to go after some of these vulnerabilities, and it started with Whitewater. In my view, and I think I won't speak for the president, but I speak for many in the White House, it has been a campaign conducted by the other party and their organizations around the country to try to run this president out of town. They did it on the grounds that they're doing it on because they came to learn early on that he had very much of his pulse on the critical issues that the people of America were concerned about. I have been very critical of the Republicans and what they have done with respect to Bill Clinton. I've also been critical of Bill Clinton for what he's done. I would be as critical of Democrats were they to savage a Republican president as Bill Clinton has been savaged. It does not speak well of the process. It does the country no good. It sets a poor example, and we wonder why the American people have such a low opinion of government.
Yes, ma'am.
Chairman Hyde has raised the expected that this whole impeachment inquiry will be over by the end of the year, but that also brings to the likelihood that this will be a lame duck Congress that finishes up this inquiry. Do you think the fact that they're lame ducks will free them to be more judicious or free them to be more reckless in their conduct?
Avis, I don't know. I would hope more judicious, and I don't know Congressman Hyde. He has a good reputation. I would hope that he would bring to bear all of his influence and his integrity on trying to work a bipartisan process within the House Judiciary Committee and then as it goes to the floor. But you can argue it both ways. You can say lame duck so you can do what the hell you want to do, or you can say lame duck that we can rise to the occasion and become statesmen. I have no idea which way it's going. I hope it's the latter.
Mr. Schuman?
Do you think the Congress will support the administration in trying to solve the difficulties of the world economy?
Well, depends on who's in Congress after the general election. I expect it to be Republican. If you take the fight over the International Monetary Fund situation, you don't hold out much hope. But hopefully, cooler heads will prevail on both the Republican side and the Democratic side. The economic situation in Russia, Southeast Asia, Brazil, are scary. And while they seem far off now, they are going to begin to have a dramatic impact on our country and on the well-being of many, many, many of our people. And unless we are prepared as a country on a bipartisan basis to deal with these kinds of situations, this country is going to be in for a very rough road down the line in terms of its economy alone. So I would hope so, but the signs are not auspicious.
Mr. Mazur?
Mr. Ickes, your position at the White House obviously provided you with a lot of excitement, opportunity, risk, uncertainty, and clearly a lot of stress you've indicated in your personal life and so forth. If you were asked by a future president to assume a prominent role as you had in the past, the way you see things right now, would you be willing or unwilling to take that position on?
It depends what day I were asked. There's some days I look back and I really question, was it worth it? I would certainly want a pretty good insurance policy, a broad indemnity clause, a signature from the Secretary of the Treasury that my legal bills would be paid. It would also depend very much on who did the asking. I point out that I had a very long, close personal relationship with Bill and Hillary Clinton. I've known them now close to 30 years. And I admire both of them greatly. They made some mistakes, but I still continue to admire them and consider them as friends. My situation was almost unique. It is rare as a hen's tooth to be asked by your friend, who is now president, to come in and serve at the level of Deputy Chief of Staff. It's, as they say, it's an offer you can't refuse. But I must say, I would have, knowing what I know, having been through what I've been through, I might have some pause, but I think on balance it was worth the candle. I'd do it again.
Yes, sir. Your name, please.
Yeah, I'm Mark Quinn. I'm a board member of the City Club. If I can, I'd like to ask a question that has nothing to do with the president's problems whatsoever.
What? We can't. No. I mean, I'm not used to even listening to those kinds of questions. What's up?
Mr. Bowles has announced that he's going to leave his office. Might we expect that he'll soon be replaced by another son of Chicago?
Is that you?
John was born here, is that correct? Yes. It's the working assumption in Washington, but those of you who have dealt with the Clinton White House know that nothing is set until it's announced, the press release is out, and the first paycheck is cut.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Jim Sweeney, who's going to win the Senate race in New York?
Well, I have my hopes, and in fact, I just sent him a $2,000 contribution, one for my wife, one for myself. Just in case the Justice Department is listening, it's all kosher. I think Chuck Schumer would make a wonderful senator, and I'll tell you one thing: he's given Alphonse D'Amato the run of his life. I think it's right down to the wire, and I hope very much that Mr. D'Amato will retire to Hempstead. But we don't know. He's pulled him out before. I think Chuck has a very good shot.
Mr. Ickes, you have a well-deserved reputation, as did your father, for acerbic and tough answers, and I'm going to give you a chance to be acerbic and tough. The last question. As one identified with Democratic fundraising, can you say that in the 1996 election, no money whatever was received from the government of China? If not, why have 116 former Democratic fundraisers either fled overseas or taken the fifth?
Well, is there a phone? I'd like to get Senator Thompson on the phone. Senator Thompson spent God knows how much of the public's money, $4 million, investigating everything up and down the line to try to figure that question out, and he still hasn't answered it. The answer is no. I can't guarantee that. But let me try to put this in a little bit of perspective. First of all, the Thompson Committee came out with this as a theory, as you know, early on in the hearings. Couldn't prove it. Couldn't come close to even showing reasonable evidence. And I think had much to do with undermining the credibility of his committee, point one. Point two is that we raised a lot of money, over $200 million. There are very technical rules. We tried our best and did our best to comply with the rules. And while some illegal contributions were in fact accepted, once it was found that they had been accepted, they were returned. There is not a national campaign or a national presidential campaign or a national Senate campaign. You would have to look hard to find where their rules have not been inadvertently broken. Just because the technicalities of it, the pressures that are involved, the speed with which things are moving, and the quantities of money that are moving. So it may well be that there may have been some Chinese government money, although the reports back in those times were that the Chinese were much more interested in influencing the Congress than they were the presidential campaign. So I can't guarantee it. I doubt it. But I think you have to come back and look at the overall context, and was their money brought in with malice aforethought and on the knowledge of the high levels of the campaign? And the answer to that is unequivocally no.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ickes, on behalf of the City Club and the Board of Directors, and as its chairman on behalf of Jay Doherty, I present to you the City Club of Chicago mug. But it is made in China, I mean to say.
Thank you.
The Terrence has one question. Let's give the Terrence one.
One more question from our alderman here.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Me a question.
Can you certify that the Republican Party has met all of the technical requirements of the federal statutes on campaign financing?
Yep. Meeting adjourned.